I guess I better turn my microphone on. That on? Okay. Neil, before you said that, I was going to defend you with our sister over here that was being hateful before. I hate to tell you, but you'll know it's him this coming Sunday when he preaches an hour and a half. And I'm sure he could make it real boring, Today we're going to talk an hour and a half about the documentary Hypothesis. And, let him tell you. He'll explain all that to you. It's a fun study. Here's how my day has gone so far. I got my sermon all ready. I was ready to go. Went to go shower and get ready and get dressed. Came back. My iPad deleted half of my lesson, and I had to retype it frantically at Neil's house. But I think it's going to be okay. Bethany usually writes my sermons anyways. So if you will, turn to John chapter 5. That'd be John chapter 5. Today we'll be at verse 44. Something I will say about Neil is every year, this is the second time I've gotten to come speak at the summer series, his lessons that I end up getting are always a challenge to me. And I appreciate that because sometimes it really helps to make me get out of the box and think about something in a way maybe I haven't before. And I'll tell you, when I selected this or was assigned this, I sat there and thought, I don't know how on earth I'm going to talk about this. And the more I talked about it, the more it's rung true to me this week. The verse, it's John chapter 5, verse 44, Jesus' question, how can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from the only God? And I got to looking at it, and at first I thought, well, I don't know how I'm going to go about that. I'm very much so a linear preacher. I like to have 3 concise points as is scriptural and go from there. But the more I got to thinking about it, the more I realized that we are a society and a species, if you want to go that far, of people who are always looking for the approval of our fellow man. And it's a real problem that it's been there since the beginning of time, and it'll be there until the good Lord comes back. But we are always searching for somebody's approval, it seems. There are some children who try their best their entire lives to get their parents' approval. Maybe they want to live up to their parents' expectations, and they have a really hard time doing that because their parents expect so much of them. There are people who maybe they want to live up to be like one of their teachers. I know that's something I've dealt with. I have great teachers in school. I want to be like them. Well, it's not really their approval we're looking for. I think about people who are big on social media or who have a following, a little bit of fame, and they're always trying their best to appease their audience. We've got to retract that statement because it hurts somebody's feelings. We don't want, we can't have that. We have people who want to appease the crowd. You have preachers who, they don't really teach the word. They teach whatever gets them the paycheck, and that's it. And as a people who are serving God, or that's what we're supposed to be doing, we have got to get over this attitude of looking to others for their approval. And I know that's something that has stomped my toes, and it will continue to stomp my toes, because I'm always worried about how people perceive me, how people think of me, how I'm pleasing somebody, or how I've made somebody upset. And I'll tell you, it puts a lot of anxiety into my faith. It comes down to a question, and that is, why do we so eagerly seek to please the world? And that's a question we've all got to ask ourselves. That's a question that we've all got to answer for ourselves. And I have a follow-up question. What if we put the same effort that we put into pleasing others into pleasing the good Lord Himself? Well, I think we would have a lot of changes in the church and in our faith. So as we enter into this, I've got a couple of observations I want to make, and then the lesson will be yours. First observation I make when I read this passage: how can you believe who receive honor from one another and do not seek the honor that comes from the living God? Well, the first thing I observe there is that you cannot seek and please both God and man at the same time. And you're going to discover that with every single thing you do. If I'm over here trying my best to please God, you're going to have somebody fussing at you. Maybe they don't like your doctrine. They don't like what you're teaching out of the Word. Maybe they don't like you because they see the way that you're living, and it kind of stomps their toes a little bit, kind of calls them to an action that they're not ready for. If you're over here serving man, you can't serve God because the same people that man really appreciate, God doesn't approve of. And if you put yourself in that position, you're going to continually be torn in a battle that's never ending and that you can never win. You know, a big part of the reason that the Pharisees hated Jesus so much was because he did not really care how they thought about it. And you see this over and over and over again in everything that he does. And even in this passage right here, John chapter 5, you back up to what he gets to talking about. Well, if you back all the way up to chapter 5, verse 16, for this reason, talking about he healed somebody, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Well, let's break that down a little bit. It wasn't wrong for somebody to heal somebody or help somebody on the Sabbath? Well, no. The Lord originally said, don't work on the Sabbath, keep it holy. Well, they then took it so far as to say, well, you can't help anybody on the Sabbath, you can't walk very far on the Sabbath. Bethany can't even keep a needle and thread in her purse and, sew somebody's pants that got ripped. That's how far they took it. And it went so far that they completely missed out on the true message, the true part of the law that God was really interested in them abiding by. And so Jesus didn't look to them for approval. He came in and he started healing on the Sabbath. And then he was telling people, I'm the Son of God. In one way or another, he would say that. And so the Pharisees hated his guts because he didn't fall in line with the rest of everybody else. And you're going to see that as you go through this life, that people are going to want you to fall into line. People are going to want you to give up on your morality, on the high standards that God has called you to for the sake of appeasing people. And we just can't be that way. I got to thinking about it, and Paul, in the way that he acted, the way that he lived, he was in a position because of his faith, because of all the good things he did, that if he wanted it, he could have had a lot of praise and recognition. If anybody deserved it, human-wise, it was Paul, but he wouldn't accept it for anything. In fact, I think about Acts chapter 14, starting there in verse 12. And Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul Hermes. They went to a place where they thought they were gods. And because he was the chief speaker, then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them. So you take somebody who probably deserved a little bit of recognition, in our eyes at least, and he tore his clothes at the very idea of being recognized in that capacity, especially at the idea of being worshipped. Paul said, I don't want this attention. If you're going to worship anybody, turn to the true God. And that's the problem that a lot of people have in the church today and in all these denominations. We're not out to please the Lord. We're out to please whatever comes our way, whatever we're wanting to do. 2 Timothy, Paul words it as to scratch their itching ears. They'll heap up for themselves false teachers. That's 2 Timothy chapter 4. But that's not the direction that God wanted us to go. You know, Jesus, as he went throughout this life, his main goal and purpose was to fulfill God's word. He wanted to fulfill God's plan for him. Even from a young age, he's 12 years old, they find him in the temple after looking for him for days. And what does he say? Woman, don't you know that I ought to be about my Father's business? He went and did things that maybe the Pharisees didn't approve of. He's healing on the Sabbath. Why are you doing this, Jesus? Well, I'm about my Father's business, he may have put as he was 12. And then he responds in that way. He didn't take it. He wasn't about to back down. In fact, he says in verse 42 here, "But I know you, that you do not have the love of God in you." Well, how does he know that they don't have the love of God in them? They're not obedient. They don't care what God says as long as they're happy and as long as these Pharisees are getting the approval they feel like they deserve from the people. They're fine. But you remember also in the same book, John 14:15, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." These people weren't interested in keeping his commandments. They were interested in keeping their own. And even then he calls them hypocrites because they didn't really keep their own commandments all that well. They were so into nitpicking that they really forgot to focus on righteousness itself. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Those you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they're full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and the dish, and the outside of them may be clean also." He's calling them out on all these hypocritical things they do. He's saying, look, you tithe to the point you're counting seeds and you're counting the spices you have, but you forget about mercy. You forget about justice. You forget about faith and what God really wants from us. And then he says, you're so focused over here on this gnat that you swallow a camel because you're over here worried about this little gnat that really ain't a big deal. He's saying, y'all are really hypocritical, and everybody sees it. You're washing the outside of the dish when it's the inside that matters. You go to pick up a cup. Maybe you check it to make sure it's clean. Maybe it's been sitting in the back of the cabinet for a while. You don't really check the outside. You check the inside to make sure there's nothing in it, And if there is, you wash it out, because that's the part that matters. Jesus didn't subject himself to their subjective rule, and therefore he was hated. He focused on true righteousness, and yet they were focused on themselves. And getting to the point for Christians, if we live a life of trying to please man, we are living a life trying to please people who are hypocritical, people who make mistakes, people who rarely keep the law like they want you to. You're never going to please them. I was having somebody, I think it was Bethany's dad, I was having a conversation with him the other day about this idea of trying to please somebody. And her daddy was telling me about this story somebody told him about a woman who she noticed her neighbor was having a hard time. And so she took her a pie. She had been going through some hard stuff. And the neighbor was so happy. She said, "Thank you so much. This really helps my day. I'm so grateful for this pie." Well, then she goes home and she thinks, well, that's awesome. That lady was really thankful for this pie. So the next week, she's sitting there thinking about her neighbor again, and she liked that recognition. So she said, "Okay, I'm going to make her another pie." And she takes her this pie, and the lady said, well, thanks. I appreciate it. That's a really nice gesture. Well, the next week she goes back. The lady says, "Okay, thanks for the pie." The next week, the lady said, "The pie, thanks for the pie. You put a little too much sugar in it this time." And then the next week, she took her this pie, and she said, "Thanks." Takes it and throws it. Well, anyway, so this lady kind of gets mad. She's not getting that recognition she thinks she deserves anymore, so she just don't make her a pie anymore. Well, the next week, she's out on a walk, and that lady sees her from her front porch and says, "Hey, where's my pie?" And you get to thinking about that. Neither of these ladies were pleased, yet one of them was really trying to please the other. She was going out of her way. "I'm going to please this lady." And she gets upset. She gets unthankful. She's not appreciative. Well, then she decides, "I'm not going to try to please her anymore." Well, now this one's upset. And as humans, that's kind of how it goes. You try to please any amount of humans, somebody's going to be upset. You're never going to truly please them. It's never going to work in your benefit. Even if you could please them, you have to recognize that people are going to die. That honor is not going to last forever. You've got to recognize that even if you could please them, this earth is going to come to an end one day, and all of it means nothing. But if I please the Lord our God, well, that means everything. I've got an eternity of celebration for what I've done. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, one of my favorite passages, John tells us, he says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." And you notice that Jesus says, "I know that you do not have the love of God in you." John chapter 5, verse 42. Well, why? Because they love the world. "For all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever." That's the point of all of this. You know, we're not out here trying to be people pleasers. And we unfortunately see a lot of our brethren who go out of their way to try to please people. And you see them moving down a path away from the Scriptures. Our duty here is to please the Lord. Jesus said, "I've been given all authority on heaven and on earth." He's been given the authority to tell us what we need to do, and it's up to us to do it. I also observed this in this passage. That is that a lack of humility and too much pride get in the way of righteousness. Our culture, increasingly so, is very self-indulged. I have a rant that I like to go on. I don't know if Neil goes on preacher rants. I do. I have a rant that I like to go on about instant gratification. We live in a world where if we want something, we get it like that. Even out here in the sticks, you know, you can order on Amazon and have it here next week. Pretty easy. We were at Bethany's grandparents' house a few months back, and they kept talking about black licorice jelly beans, which, disgusting. They couldn't figure out, though, why they couldn't find them on the shelves. I know why you can't find them on the shelves. But anyways, while we were there, I ordered them, and before we left their house that evening, they had it there. That's just how the world works. If I want some approval of man, I get on Facebook and I say something that I think somebody will like. If I want to know something, I just look it up. And when it comes to honor, we don't want to wait for that honor that comes from God for being righteous. We want honor instantly. So we'll do whatever it takes to get it. And it causes a lot of pride and humility. Not only that, we are so afraid to tell somebody else, "I've been struggling." We fail to admit to our problems, and we end up with a bunch of people who are not willing to change, not willing to fess up when they mess up, not willing to do what's right. We keep talking about pride and how it gets in the way of righteousness. The Pharisees had Jesus in front of them, but their pride wouldn't let them see that he was the Messiah. You know, and he talks about in this passage, you can go through and look at these yourself. Here's all the testimony that Jesus had on his behalf that he was the Christ. John the Baptist, John 5:33. The works of the Father, John 5:36. The Father himself, John 5:37. The Scriptures, John 5:39. Moses, John 5:46. And there's a reference back to Deuteronomy 18 that says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear." And Jesus is saying, look, I've got all this testimony on my behalf. None of it's from you. But you won't believe it because it's not from you. And he's saying, you don't get it because your pride is in the way of it. And too much pride is what causes so many problems, so many fusses, so many people to refuse to move to what's right. We have an unwillingness to admit to faults. We have an unwillingness to settle disputes. We have an unwillingness to believe what's right. Well, why is that? Well, it's always been this way. And this is how I see it, and I'm not changing. Or, well, you know, so-and-so was doing that in my family, and I'm just not going to say he was sinning. Well, that's where we get into some problems. James chapter 4, verse 7. James writes, "Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. We're not here to be lifted up by each other. We're not here to be lifted up by anybody outside these doors. We are here to live in such a way that in the end we're lifted up by the Lord. When we have too much pride, it has a disastrous effect on our souls. One of my favorite passages I like to look at is Romans chapter 1, verse 20, and especially when talking about evidence of the Creator. But you look at what pride causes here. For since the creation of the world his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So just like Jesus is talking about, there's plenty of proof here that Jesus is the Messiah. Right here, there's plenty of proof that there's a Creator. He continues on, because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Just like the Pharisees, these folks over here, he's talking about in Romans, despite all that proof, they still refuse to see the God that created everything. They still refuse to see the God that they ought to be serving. Why is that? They were deceitful. They were deceived. They weren't thankful. They became futile. They were foolish. That's why they didn't turn to what's right. As Christians and as people who are God-fearers, we do not want to be foolish. It is our job to discern here on this earth whether or not our glory and honor is coming from the Lord or whether or not it's coming from man. I would propose that our society may not worship idols made out of wood and gold and diamonds, but we do worship idols ourselves and maybe our technology that we have. We don't give that honor to the God above as we should. And it's a real problem. It's a reason I think that the church does not grow like we'd like it to. The world is so busy seeking man's approval that we don't really look to God for what's important. As I come to a kind of conclusion, reading this has kind of stomped on my toes a little bit because, being honest with you, I am one who, I'm always scared I've hurt somebody's feelings. Or I'm always scared that maybe I made somebody mad by something I said. And the reality of it is, if I'm preaching from the Word, and if you're speaking from the Word, if their feelings are hurt, chances are it needs to be hurt. The Pharisees, they really needed their feelings hurt. They just wouldn't allow themselves to have those hurt feelings. And when they did, they didn't show godly sorrow. I think as we leave here tonight, I'm going to push you all to ask yourself some questions as the week goes on and try to answer them honestly. I know we're not always completely honest with ourselves. Who are you getting your honor from? Where is the source of your honor? Well, if you can't say it's the Lord, something needs to change. Whose opinion matters? Well, I know the Lord's opinion matters, and your spouse's opinion matters if they're doing what's right. But apart from that, you're not really here to please anybody else. Kind of like if another woman were to come up to me and tell me my hair was a mess. I don't really care. You're not my wife. Well, that's how we need to see it. My final question for you tonight: who have you been living to please? Have you been living to please yourself? Have you been living to please so-and-so at church or so-and-so next door or your parents or the world or whoever? It's time to change it. If your answer is anything but God, you're not doing what's right. I'm going to go ahead and offer an invitation. I guess that's an invitation song you got. I'm going to go ahead and offer an invitation. There's no reason to walk away from here tonight questioning your salvation. Because if you're living for God, one of the parts of that glory He offers is that you have an eternity with Him. And we can be assured of that. John writes in 1 John chapter 5, verse 13, we can know that we have salvation. You can know that. Maybe you've been seeking honor outside of these walls, outside of the Lord. It's time to change it. And there's nothing shameful about it. There's nothing wrong with coming forward and fixing things if that's what you need to do. If you need to fix your life, if you need the prayers of the church, if you need to put Christ on in baptism, we'd be happy to help you while Neil leads us in song.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to Him I